The Dickheads are presented in color.
Hello, Dickheads, like a pink laser beam of truth beaming from glorious England and unfortunately rural Ohio into your brain holes. I am one of your personal dickheads, D. Harlan Wilson, and I'm very happy to be here today with Anthony Peake, the author of the biography A Life of Philip K. Dick, the man who remembered the future, right there. As well as quite a few other books, most of which deal with the study of consciousness and perception, if I'm not mistaken. And incidentally, do you go by Tony or Anthony? What do you prefer?
I go by Tony to my friends, so let's go with Tony.
Thank you. The man who remembered the future, which is what I'm going to refer to as whatever. Hardcover came out in 2013 and the paperback in 2017.
I think the hardback, I've only actually got the hardback version, which came out in, just to confirm, I've got so many books out there these days, 2013.
Okay. But then there was about a 4-year gap between that and the paperback.
Yeah, maybe the paperback came out in the States. It's only ever come out in hardback edition in the UK.
Okay. And is that all through Arcturus?
It is, yeah. I have 4 or 5 different publishing houses, but Arcturus has probably published more of my books than any other publisher, which is really good. And in fact, interestingly enough, this is the only book that Arcturus have asked me to write. All the other books I pitched to them when they said whether they would take them or not. But this one, they were very, very interested in me writing. So they said to me, would you like to write a book on Philip K. Dick? Which was interesting. And I was quite delighted to do that.
So they brought the idea to you?
Yeah. Although I'd mentioned the work of Philip K. Dick in various other previous books, they thought that I had sufficient material to write a new biography of Philip K. Dick, because I think my editor at the time was a huge Philip K. Dick fan as well, and was quite interested in the angle I was taking on Philip K. Dick, and thought that there was legs for this. So they said to me, would you consider writing a book for us on this subject? Which I said, yes, I'd be delighted to. So
at the time, that's interesting, because I thought that was one of my central questions I was going to put to you. How you came to this book on Philip K. Dick. So I wonder if there was something, now it's making me think what was going on at that time around, in the early 2010s that would have prompted them to come to you with a Philip K. Dick idea like that. Do you recall? Or was it just...
I suspect.
Yeah.
I suspect it's just because he was becoming more and more popular in terms of the movies.
Yeah.
And because the influence, they were as much interested. They initially wanted me to write a book on the influences of Philip K. Dick on ideas. And I was more keen to dive into Philip K. Dick, the man, because to me, there were so many curious questions in my head about what was going on in his mind, 2374 and everything else, which I touched upon in my book, The Daemon. The final chapter of my book, The Daemon, has a section called The Owl in Daylight. And that was about Philip K. Dick. And there were so many unanswered questions for me and for my editor at that time. They said, look, really, with the subject matter you deal with now, it's going to be wonderful if you could revisit Philip K. Dick and his work in line of the areas you've been researching over the last 15 years or whatever, and let us know what you come up with. And they were quite delighted with what I came up with. But the curious thing was that, as you know, when you are traditionally published, that is, you are not vanity published or you don't pay the publisher to publish your books,
Sure.
The publisher tends to have ultimate control. And what happened was they were very keen to place Phil's life within the historical aspects of the times that he was writing in. And what they did was, when the book went for editing, I worked very closely with the editors, as I always do, the external editors and the proofreaders. And the external editor decided that he would actually add to each of the chapters a historical perspective, which he did, and consistently got things wrong, which was rather irritating because my publisher never even allowed me to see the final version that went out. So I'm glibly responding to people's questions about the book, and somebody comes up and says, are you a complete idiot? John F. Kennedy was not assassinated in Houston. He was assassinated in Dallas. And I went rushing to the book and read the book, and this editor had actually said that. So that was quite irritating. And for a time, there was a slight degree of friction between myself and that publisher, purely and simply because of that. But we got over it.
Yeah.
In the end, and I said I wouldn't work with that editor again, really. And now, because I'm the second biggest author in terms of book sales, I can tend to be a little bit more push my own way a little bit.
Yeah,
So,
you want your autonomy, sure.
Oh yeah, to a degree I do, but I do find that my publishers really help me because they come up with ideas, and I work very closely with them. And particularly when you go through the editorial process, because you find yourself, surely, when you're so close to a book, you don't see not necessarily the errors, but the structural aspects and things, and it takes somebody else to look at them. And I find, when I reread my own books, I see things. I read the book as a reader, because rather like Philip K. Dick, I very much write my books almost in a fugue. There are things I do not remember, and I'll go back to sections and I'll go, good Lord, did I write that? Where the hell did I get that turn of phrase from? My wife says it all the time. I'm just really grumpy and really difficult to deal with when I'm writing. And it's because of the creative process that I use, and that's why Phil's work fascinates me so much.
Is it so because I write in short bursts frequently, but sounds like the opposite of what you do. So like Phil, I assume probably not so amphetamine fueled as Phil was. But so you'll do you'll just sit there, hone in hours at a time.
Yeah, some days I can't write anything. Some days it just doesn't, the muse doesn't work, or what I would argue my daemon is not imminent.
Yeah.
And therefore it's not guiding me or helping me. That sounds very, very esoteric. It's not meant to be. It's much more pragmatic than that. But for me, the writing process is I will write when I'm inspired to write. And usually what happens is I write a book and then I write it again. So I'll finish the book and then dump everything and say, no, I don't like that. I'll completely take a new approach. The reason being that I've always used the analysis in my writing. I feel like I'm Frederick Schliemann discovering Troy. So, I get to the Hill of Hisarlik and I start digging randomly and I find things and I go, oh, that's interesting. I'll write about that. And then I'll dig a little bit deeper and suddenly the links will come. And this is where the daemon comes in, because I'll suddenly find things I'd been interested in previously suddenly link in. It's like you're discovering the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle and suddenly it fits. Like when I wrote my first book, I had no intention of writing a book trying to explain what happens to human consciousness at the point of death. My initial reason for writing the book was understanding Deja Vu as a phenomenon. And that's what I was interested in. But as the book developed, I was getting more and more information about the neurological aspects of near-death experiences and how they were similar to temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, and various other brain structures, and how the temporal lobes were really involved in this. And of course, in my book, I argue that Phil himself was a temporal lobe libel, in the sense that his temporal lobe seemed to be quite sensitive to things, but we'll come into that. But I just found that the books create themselves as I develop. So it means sometimes I will bin work, or I'll speak to somebody who will contact me, and synchronicities happen so extraordinarily that something will be delivered to me. Like, for instance, in one of my books, the very last day that I was sending the book off to the publishers, somebody emailed me. And the person emailed me with something so extraordinary that I literally rewrote the last chapter. And said to my publishers, I need to delay for 3 or 4 days because I need to rewrite the last chapter. So my writing process is very iterative, and also because I have a very peculiar memory in that if I've read something, I tend to remember it. And I've been a massive reader for most of my life. But what tends to happen is that I will get a thing in my head and I'll read about it. And then suddenly all this other information downloads into me and I'll go, I can link that. Because people have turned around to me and say, how do you write your books? You have a degree, you did postgraduate research and everything, but I'm very much a sociologist and a historian. But they said, you write about quantum mechanics. You write about neurology, you write about neurochemistry. How do you bring all these things together? And I'll just say it just seems to click.
Yeah.
I'll read something and I'll go, I mean, an example of this is this book here, The Blind Watchmaker, which is Richard Dawkins. And I kept discovering things in there, and I'd suddenly remember and say, Richard Dawkins said something about this, mitochondria, and he wrote about it. I need to find it. And I'll go to the book, and there it is. It's as if it's supplied to me. It's extraordinary. As Phil himself said, when he was talking about the Sibyls, and he was talking about the guiding spirit he had, his daemon, which he describes. I feel very much the same way. I just think that I'm following a path that's already been laid out for me because I've done it many times before.
And this idea of being interdisciplinary is particularly Phil Dickian. I pull from a lot of different things as well: philosophy, literary theory, film, comics. Often bringing them all together. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, Phil's was, and this is, he existed in a pre-internet time. He was pulling and reading all different types of sources and reading different things, and became increasingly philosophical and so forth. But, well, actually, this is you've started to talk about your work. It's a good segue into, I want, before we were talking about how I've been using Chat GPT recently to do some research, and thought I'd have a little fun here. And I put into Chat GPT your biography. I said, please generate a 4-sentence biography of Anthony Peake. I'm just going to read it to you, and then and this is, for me, it's really quite new because I'm an English professor. So while I'm aware that my students are using AI, I don't disallow it, but I am very wary about it. If you're using AI to write, you should have all the words in your head first. You shouldn't be, for instance, using words that you don't know what they are, among other things. In any case, for folks like us, if we're doing research, it's just in the last month, hours I've saved just pinpointing very specific things about, well, Philip K. Dick, for instance, in the Philip K. Dick Society newsletter. There were particular types of information that would have taken me a long time to find, found it like that. It's not always accurate, though. AI isn't, where it'll be tomorrow, let alone in a year. Who knows? It will all be redundant by then, perhaps. Anyway, so here's your biography, and let me know how accurate or inaccurate it is. You've already touched on a couple of these things. Anthony Peake is a British author and researcher specializing in consciousness studies, near-death experiences, and the nature of reality. He holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and a master's equivalent in economics. Since the publication of his first book, Is There Life After Death, in 2006, Peake has authored several works exploring human consciousness and extraordinary experiences. Notable publications include The Daemon, a Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, and The Hidden Universe, an investigation into non-human intelligence. And then finally, Peake's work often integrates concepts from quantum physics, neurology, and esoteric traditions to propose theories about human perception and the continuity of consciousness beyond death. Are those the two books that you might foreground, or?
Yeah, they're probably fairly good choice, I think, in terms of the width of my inquiry. So yes, I probably quite like that. I would think that probably where they've missed out is something else that fascinates me, which also fascinated Phil, which is the idea of the holographic nature of reality and the way in which reality seems to be mathematical in structure, which is an area, and particularly I've been writing more and more about dimethyltryptamine over recent years and working with researchers into this. So what I tend to do is if I can't find the information, I have many academic contacts who will help me out. Like, for instance, my new book on near-death.
Pardon me, I'm sorry. You didn't say diphenhydramine, did you?
Dimethyltryptamine.
Okay. Could you explain that just briefly?
DMT. Dimethyltryptamine is probably the most powerful hallucinogenic substance known to man. Okay. And it has been found in many, many plants. It's found in the human body. It's being found inside the spinocerebral fluid. And recently, in 2017, it was discovered for the first time in the pineal gland of a live mammal, i.e. a rat. So there is an argument that dimethyltryptamine is, as Rick Strassman, who was the guy that wrote the definitive book on it called The Spirit Molecule. Strassman is a doctor who works at the University of New Mexico, and he was employed by the American government in the mid-1990s to do research into the effects of dimethyltryptamine. And he came to the conclusion that effectively it's our reality modulator. And in my work, working with my academic associates, I've come to the conclusion that dimethyltryptamine is effectively synthesized from melatonin into what we call metatonin, which is endogenously generated DMT. And this is extraordinary if this is the case. Now, there is a group of researchers at the moment. Funnily enough, the foreword of my new book on near-death experiences is written by an up-and-coming young neuroscientist called Dr. Pascal Michael, who's doing some fantastic research in this area. And they've discovered that this substance seems to be able to facilitate contact with entities. For instance, there's a team working at the moment at Imperial College in London doing research with volunteers who are taking DMT intravenously. And in doing so, they're encountering entities rather similar to the elves, you know, the idea of the kind of the quixotic creatures that you come across when you're in altered states of consciousness. And they have, Terence McKenna, I think they call them the machine elves. And I mean, for instance, an example, one of my researcher friends took DMT intravenously, found himself what's called the DMT zone. And this entity comes over to an insectoid entity comes over to him, prods him and goes, "You shouldn't be doing it this way. This is the wrong way to do it." And then receded back into the darkness. A bit like I could do if I went backwards now. And he then, 2 weeks later, he comes back, takes the intravenous DMT, and the same creature came over and said, "I told you last time, this is not the way you should be doing it." And this astonished him because he said, "I thought it was part of my subconscious that I was generating here." But this entity showed motivations, it showed lots of feelings. And this can be tied in with Phil's work, you know, because Phil was very much interested in the role of these substances in terms of altered states of consciousness. You know, if you read his exegesis, he was really fascinated with the entities he encountered. I mean, he wrote a famous short, well, not a famous short story, but was it the Book of the Sibyl or something, where he encounters entities that have the pineal gland and they have a third eye. Now, these creatures that these guys encounter are extraordinarily similar to greys. You know, the alien greys that people report. And I was talking about this recently with Whitley Strieber, you know, the guy that did the book.
Communion.
You know, and Phil.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, Phil contacted Whitley. Whitley told me that he was in contact with Phil. Towards the end of his life, Phil was so intrigued by what was happening to him. He contacted Whitley because he discovered he was intrigued by the similarities between the entities he described, which he said they had avocado-shaped faces and big eyes, and this third eye. And so an associate writer pointed out to Phil and said, well, these are actually very similar to the entities that Betty and Barney Hill, the famous abduction case in 1961, I think it was, in upstate New Hampshire, where this couple were abducted by aliens. And Phil said the creatures he was coming into contact with were very similar. In fact, there's an amazing, in the exegesis, there's a hand drawing. Have you seen it? There's a drawing he does of the entities.
I probably.
The Sibyl.
Yeah.
And it's just like an alien grey. And it's exactly the same creature that was on the cover of Whitley Strieber's book, Communion.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
Okay. Now, Whitley and I, I'll be meeting again this year. We do an event in Southern California called Contact in the Desert, which is about alien encounters and UFOs and things. And in fact, last year I did a presentation there on Philip K. Dick, which went down incredibly well. People loved it. So it opened up an awful lot of people's minds to what Philip K. Dick was writing about. But And these entities.
Whitley still, just out of curiosity, he's still writing, isn't he?
Yeah, yeah. Whitley, I met Whitley in London about 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And we're planning to work together on various projects.
Oh, wow.
But Whitley, no, he's still fired up with a lot of work he's doing, and he was telling me some extraordinary things of his own entity encounters, that he's never reported before. So I won't share them here because it's up to him to report them. But of course, Whitley had an encounter with an entity he called the Master of the Key in a hotel room in Toronto. And if you read what happened to him and some of the elements that Phil talked about, when he was abducted in Vancouver, and his encounter with what I would describe as men in black, because he claimed he was abducted by these people. So Phil himself was really intrigued by this whole, because, he had this concept of the homoplasmate.
Yes.
And the idea that we are plasmates, but we need to be broadened out and we need to get our right and left hemispheres in sync. And by doing that, we become a more unified being, which is exactly what I argue. I have a concept called the Daemonadal dyad.
I was going to ask about that.
Okay. And that's very similar to where Phil was coming from, because it's people like Orenstein and Julian James and various other writers who were coming up with the same ideas that were really stimulating Phil into coming up with ideas that were extraordinarily similar to my own. And every time when I was dwelling into writing the biography of Phil, I was going, my God, he and I would have got on so well, because his mind was the same as mine and he went down exactly the same tracks as I did. It's extraordinary how many themes, because for my sins, I read right through the exegesis and I read all the letters, the bound volumes of the letters, and then tied the letters to the events in the other biographies to see whether they matched or not. Huh. And that was intriguing. And by the end of the exercise, I felt I was becoming Philip K. Dick. I felt I'd have to stop soon because I'm thinking like him,
That's a common feeling. I'm writing a book on the biographies of Dick, and it's a common experience among people that write about him.
Well, funnily enough, you'll be interested as an English professor, is that the only other biography I've done was of the British writer, playwright J.B. Priestley. And it was similar with J.B. Priestley. I mean, have you heard of Priestley at all?
I have. I'm not well read.
You need to check him out.
Yeah.
He is extraordinary.
I'm a playwright too. He's mostly a playwright, huh?
He wrote novels, but it was his plays that were extraordinary. And his plays were very similar to a lot of the thinking of Philip K. Dick. I mean, for instance, the way Philip K. Dick had the concept of orthogonal time and the idea that there was vertical time and orthogonal time that runs as a right angle off this time. And that, like the layers of an onion, there's nested times. This is exactly what Priestley argued. He took the writings of a guy called J.W. Dunn, John William Dunn, who was an Anglo-Irish aeronautical engineer who was writing around the 1920s. And Dunn, in 1927, wrote a book called An Experiment with Time, because he found that if he kept notes of his dreams, lots of them were precognitive, just like Phil. And he like Phil, he believed he was a precog. And his book became really popular in the 1930s with the intelligentsia. And Priestley picked up on this, and he wrote a series of plays based upon the writings of J.W. Dunn. So, like, if you read his book, Time and the Conways, or his play Time and the Conways, it's a massive time slip, and it's so cleverly done. Cleverly done, pun on done, So, and Phil was interested. I was amazed that Phil, in his writings, never came across the writings of J.W. Dunn, because I'd have thought if he'd have found it, he would have run with it. But Priestley did, and he wrote some fascinating work. It's well worth you checking it out.
Yeah, for
because
sure.
The parallels between the two of them is extraordinary. And because I was saying, go on.
Oh no, I was just going to ask. Could you reiterate what's the title of your book on him, Priestley?
It's called Time and the Rose Garden.
Okay.
It's because I'm so preoccupied with time. I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time many years ago, which also features Philip K. Dick and J.B. Priestley. Because J.B. Priestley was convinced again that, there are different levels of time. Now, again, going back this is a fascinating idea, and Phil would have loved this if he'd known about J.W. Dunn with his orthogonal time principles. What Dunn argued was, and it's so clever, he turned around and he said, we know that time flows. Now, we don't know where time flows round us or we flow through time. But the issue is with time flowing, what is time flowing against? In other words, if you look at a river that's flowing, you can see the riverbanks. So you know the river's moving. So you have this feeling of flow. But there's nothing we can measure time against. I mean, time is the only thing I know that's measured by itself. You ever have a minute of a minute or an hour of an hour? And that's why time dilation is so subjective. Whereas you can have a pound of apples and everything else. So what Don said was, time does flow, and it flows against another form of time, which he called time two. So there's a time two that time flows against. And within time two, there is a version of your consciousness. So time one is in the time flow, the normal time flow, and observer one. Then observer two is in the second form of time. And observer two's specious present, as the American psychologist, whose name escapes me now, called it. His name will come to me. But he had the idea of specious present, the idea that the present moment can spread out. Instead of being an instant, it can be slightly broader. And when you go into time two in dreams and everything, your specious present goes out to being maybe a week or two, and you get inklings of the future, which then feeds into your subconscious and then feeds your dreams. And then your dreams create fantasies based upon actual things you are going to experience in your future. Now, of course, this is what Phil argued. Phil argued that orthogonal time runs at a right angle to this time. And we can, under some circumstances, apprehend the part of us that is part of the greater something. Because, as you know, he had these terms, the idios cosmos and the koinos cosmos.
Yep. And
he was interested in Berkeley. He was interested in the writings of Kant and various other philosophers. And his idea was that there is a broader time, but also we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, and that we are kind of emanations of a greater consciousness field. And this is why he was fascinated by the writings of people like Maurice Bucke, the guy in 1901 who wrote an amazing book about the collective consciousness, the way consciousness is a field and we attune into it. And this is what Phil believed. And he believed that when he went into particularly hypnagogic states, he was able to perceive a greater reality. And this is where his plots fed down. This is why he came across his idea, in Ubik, the concept of half-life, and the way Ronseter and his associates are living in this half-life, and they're communicating in to their business associates who are in this reality. Now, again, as I'm on a theme here, this is again evidence of how Phil was influenced by Gnosticism and the idea that this reality is an hallucination. This reality is as he called it, we are existing in the black iron prison.
Yeah.
Remember, he used this term, the black iron prison. We're trapped in the black iron prison, but there is another reality above the black iron prison called the palm tree garden. And this comes right back to Gnosticism, because the Gnostics had two terms they called the reality we are, the hallucinatory reality we are trapped in, they called it the kenoma. And there's a reality behind that called the pleroma. And this again is exactly what Phil was arguing. And of course, we know from the Wachowski brothers when they played with the Matrix, this was exactly what Phil was predicting. This is exactly what Phil was arguing. And I believe that a lot of people miss this about Philip K. Dick. He was incredible autodidact.
Yep.
But he put together information in the most extraordinary ways. And he wove into his novels a fictionalized account of the things that were actually happening in his life. He was trying to put across these extraordinary experiences, like he did in Valis. Valis, he was talking to Valis. Valis was something that was communicating with him. He had this concept of Firebright, which was this entity that would bounce around the room when he lived in Fullerton. And Tessa wrote a book about it, didn't he, called Remembering Firebright. But then he had these other strange hypnagogic effects, and he had memories of being somebody else, memories, of going back to being the first century Christian guy, when he believed, that we were all trapped and it was all 33 AD, and we'd just been stuck in this time zone.
And
Extraordinary
incidentally,
stuff.
you mentioned the Eye of the Sibyl earlier. That's precise. It's about the Black Iron Prison, and has a lot to do with the perception and the pineal gland
Yeah. I
unlock.
mean,
But it
and it
was
was unlockable.
Lovecraftian too. When you mentioned that, it reminded me. First thing that leapt to my mind, well, Burroughs and Naked Lunch, but
Yeah.
the film From Beyond.
Remind me, From Beyond. I
That,
should know that.
so that's it's based on a Lovecraft story. I think of the
Oh,
same
it's
name.
Lovecraft. Yeah.
Yeah, where mad scientist has this machine that I think stimulates the pineal gland,
Ah,
and they
yes.
can
Yeah.
see entities from alternate or adjacent dimensions that are toxic, of course.
Do you know, this is so funny because a couple of days ago, the way synchronicities happen in my life, in that I was now why was I discussing Lovecraft? I can't remember. It came up in some reason, and I was discussing with somebody Lovecraft, and then I mentioned in passing. Oh no, that's right. One of my friends posted something about a lady called Laurie Cabot, who runs the Witchcraft Museum in Salem, in Massachusetts. And in 1990, I
My girls
spent a
have been
month.
there. My daughters have been to that museum.
Oh,
Yeah.
wonderful!
Yeah.
Right. So they'll know that directly across the road is a hotel called the Hawthorne Hotel. And I stayed there for a month in 1990. And I used to spend time going across the road because I was on a business secondment. And I used to go across the road to the museum, to the Witchcraft Museum. And I got to know Laurie Cabot in passing. And I guess she's a Cabot of the Brahmins, the New England Brahmin families. The little group of people that were up in Concord in the 1890s. They were doing this wonderful esoteric stuff and philosophy and things. But somebody posted about that, and I thought, how interesting this is. And I posted on Facebook something about it and the way I'd met Laurie Cabot, and I put it on Instagram. And then literally yesterday afternoon, a fellow writer friend of mine called Thomas Sheridan posts a map of New England, the New England area, influenced by Lovecraft, and he called it Lovecraft Country. And on the map was Salem, where I was, Beverly, where I worked, and lots of other places. And I was going, this is so weird, the way that works. And of course, I write about synchronicities,
Yeah.
and how the kind of the Jungian implementation of these things. But you go, wow, it's as if your world, as I argue in my books, we collapse the wave function of our intentions in quantum mechanics. The idea that until an object is observed, it literally exists in a state of superposition. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But it's been discovered using something called the twin slit experiment, that as soon as the object is measured or perceived, it collapses from being a statistical wave of being anywhere into a point particle located in a particular location in space and time. Okay? So this means effectively that our acts of observation collectively collapse the wave function of our reality. So literally our intentions can bring about the creation of what I call the egregore. And this is very much, again, it's very Lovecraftian. The idea of, you can create Cthulhu by drawing him through.
Wait, that's your term, egregore?
Egregore is originally it's biblical, and it's from biblical Greek, and it literally means watcher. But the term egregore is also used by magicians and people involved in magic as a thought form that you can create that can become independent of you. And in my book, The Hidden Universe, this is the central theme I use. The idea that we collectively create reality around us, but we also can collectively create entities by our own anticipations of them. I'll give an example of this, that in 1970, a group of researchers in Toronto, they were playing around with Ouija boards, and they were quite interested in the fact that they seemed to be influencing where it went. And they thought, let's see if this is us or not. So one of them went away and spent a week or two creating a mythical character called Philip Aylesford. And they gave him a whole backstory that he was a Catholic guy in the 1680s after the English Civil War. He was an outsider because he was a Catholic, therefore the Puritans would causing him a problem. He was in a loveless marriage. He meets a gypsy girl, falls in love with her. His wife finds out. He kills himself by jumping off the battlements of his castle. But it was complete fiction. They started manifesting him using the Ouija board, which was fascinating because the backstory came. So they were collectively creating this entity. But then the table started to levitate, started to move, and Philip started to develop a freedom from them. And indeed, if you want to go on YouTube, they did the table turning live on Canadian television, and you can actually see it happening. Now, I argue
take place. What you do you around what year?
1970. It's called the Philip experiment. Okay. Now, I argue from this that it seems that we can create these entities in some way. Now, I give examples. There's a lady called Alexander Neal, who was a Belgian traveler in Tibet in the 1920s. And her group created, by a thought form, it's called a tulpa. And they created this thought form, which was a little monk. And it started to manifest. And it then started to be nasty. And they had to think it away to get rid of it because it was so nasty. So I argue that these things, I call them egregores, because, as I say, in mysticism, for instance, Pepsi Cola is an egregore. You know, we create these marketing egregores. Nazism is an egregore. Socialism is an egregore. They're all things that humanity create that seem to become independent in some way or other. Now, I've got examples in some of my books.
Are they just in an effort to better understand this? So when you said that, I don't know why, my mind went to Althusser and ideological apparatuses. Are they connected to belief systems, the egregores?
Oh yes, very much so.
Okay.
This is why certain cultures have the belief systems, and I actually argue that a culture itself creates its own shibboleths. It creates its own themes by anticipating things. Like I argue, for instance, the people when they saw the sun spin in the sky at Fatima in 1917 or wherever it was, they were collectively creating the anticipation that was going to happen, and they witnessed it. And it's because we seem to be able to bring these things into existence. Like in my book, The Daemon, I have whole sections of writers, and Phil did this, so we're nicely coming back to Phil, whereby you would create a character in your book, and then in your own future, you would meet that character as if your future self has backfed the information to create the storyline. Like E. Housman, I think it was, or was it an F.E. Bates? It's one of the writers. And he writes a story about people on a cruise. And there is this very negative female character, and he gives her a name. And he writes this story. And then 3 or 4 years later, he's on a cruise, and he sees the woman appear wearing the clothes he described, with the luggage he described, with the little husband he described in his book. And he watched the story unfold on the cruise that he'd written about 10 years before. And he said, this proves, which Phil argued, was that our future selves in dreams or in hypnagogic states or in fugue states when you're writing can feed you with a story. Because we know Phil did this. You know, the classic story of Phil, wasn't it? From the policeman said, that story, you know, where he... Buckman, you know, where in the story, Phil has him go to an all-night petrol station. And while he's there, a black man appears and asks him for money. And that's how the story then develops. I don't know if you know, but 5 or 6 years later, Phil got up one day to post, or early one or late one night, to post some letters. And he posted some letters. And on the way back, a guy approaches him and says, I'm in desperate need. I need money for some petrol. So Phil helps him, takes him to the petrol station. And then he's at the petrol station. He goes, my God, this is my story. I wrote this in my Tears, the Policeman said, many years before. And he said, I was living my own fiction. And he said that happened many times to him.
Yeah, and you, in fact, at the end of I think in the third part, there are three parts in your biography and an
Yeah.
epilogue.
Yeah.
You go through quite a few of those, Flow My Tears being one of them, in terms of Phil's earlier stories kind of coming to life in his real life later on. And in addition, you said, if I'm not mistaken, that mostly because the book centers on his precognitive abilities, right? That's
Yeah.
ultimately what that's
The
the
man who remembered the future. Yeah.
right. But they're primarily oneric, right? It's I think you said that in the end. That was one of your culminating theses, that his experience was with the future was primarily through the medium of dreams.
Mainly on Eric, yeah. Mainly through dreams, but also through the hypnagogic state or the hypnagogic state, which is that liminal space between sleeping and awaking. So in when you're going to sleep at night, you will see sometimes faces in profile and things. And when you're waking up in the morning, it's called hypnopompia.
Hmm.
And I argue this is when the doors of perception. I wrote a book called Opening the Doors of Perception, which was a writing of Aldous Huxley's 1954
Huxley,
book.
right?
Yeah, so it's Huxley. And I argue that when you're in these liminal states, the doors of perception are more open, which means that information from the information field, and in my latest book, I discuss how the information field works, can leak through and can stimulate dreams or ideas. And sometimes they can do them subliminally. Now, for instance, I was talking about J.B. Priestley earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, J.B. Priestley had a concept he called an FIP, future influences past, because he had many examples himself of things that would influence him now that he wouldn't perceive until the future. So, in other words, he'd get this feeling or sensation, and he would write something about it, and then, as Phil did, many years later, he would experience it. And he argues again that there is this kind of back forwardization of information. And I'll give you a classic example of this. In one of my books, there is, again, a writer you're probably aware of, Rudyard Kipling.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Kipling, in his autobiography, Something of Me, talked about his daemon, which is Phil's Sybil. It's the daemon that I talk about. It's this other part of ourselves, the part of our consciousness, I think, that is found within the brain, but within what is called the glial network. I'm bouncing all over the place, but effectively neurologically. Now, neurologically, you hear the term, we only use 1/10 of our brain. Most people use that term, but they don't know what it means. What it actually means is that 1/10 of the brain is made up of neurons, and neurons communicate electrochemically by literally firing things called neurotransmitters, lost in synapses, to communicate from neuron to neuron via the dendrites. Now, that's 10% of the brain, but the remaining 90% of the brain is made up of cells called glial cells. And glial is Latin for glue, because when Gogol and Cajol and the other people, when they were doing scanning of the brain, came to the conclusion that the neurons were supported by the glial cells. Now, recent information neurologically has discovered that the glial cells communicate non-locally, again using quantum mechanical principles of non-locality. They communicate instantaneously. And I argue that we have two loci of consciousness in our brain, the daemon and the eidolon. And the eidolon communicates using neurons and eidolonic consciousness, but demonic consciousness communicates non-locally using the other 90% of the brain. And that part of the brain can download information from an external information field, which I think exists in what's called 0-point energy. And that can be uploaded. Now, as I said before, I have this idea of the eidolon, which is our linear self that lives life once. But we have the daemon that lives our lives many times. The daemon itself can then, above the daemon, and I can't prove this scientifically, but I'm working on it. Above the daemon, I argue there's something called the uberdaemon. And the uberdaemon is the equivalent of the Jungian collective unconscious. It's the memory field of all humanity. And under certain circumstances, our consciousness can access the information field of that next level of consciousness, which is what Phil was talking about in the exegesis. He doesn't do the science as I do it. But he was right. He was spot on. This is exactly what I think is going on. And you can then attune into this greater consciousness, which is timeless, which exists in orthogonal time. And this is where the information downloads, where we can see the future, we can see the past. Because within orthogonal time, because as you know, time and space are the same thing. Within cosmology, as you get nearer to the speed of light, time and space change into each other. So it's not at all peculiar. Also, I argue this information field, I don't know if you know, but 0-point field is a form of energy that exists in the quantum vacuum. And it's everywhere. Okay, so it's information now. Also, scientifically now, they're now coming to the conclusion that what we think is external reality is holographic in nature. So what we think is externally out there is holographic. It's made up of holograms. And the brain processes these holograms in structures in the brain called microtubules. Okay. Also, it's digital and it's based on maths. So effectively, we're living in a computer simulation, which is again one of the points that Phil tried to make when he was talking about the black iron prison. That's the simulation. We are in the simulation because now we're in the position we can do the science of this. But literally, I'm the only writer on the planet, and that seriously is pulling this all together.
Yeah.
Because the quantum physicists are not thinking about the broader picture, neither are the neurologists and the neurochemists. Whereas I'm sitting there melding this all together as Phil did, as a polymath, to bring it all together to go, well, if we look at how the brain structures here, and we look at, because Phil, remember, was fascinated by split brain operations. Mm-hmm. Do you remember in the books he was fascinated by, and he does this in, what's the novel? There's one novel where somebody has a split brain.
Scanner Darkly.
Scanner Darkly.
Yeah.
And he was doing this in Scanner Darkly because he came across the work of somebody called Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry. And in the 1950s and early 1960s, they did a series of experiments where they cut the corpus callosum of people who had intractable epilepsy in order to stop the epilepsy spreading from the dominant hemisphere to the non-dominant hemisphere and vice versa. When they did this, they ended up with two complete different personalities. And this intrigued Phil. And this is why in Scanner Darkly, he was so fascinated by it, by the idea that if you cut the two hemispheres, you end up with two different personalities.
Yeah.
And if you go through his books, he talks about, and this is what he was doing in Valis. You know, he had Philip Dick, the science fiction writer, and he had Horselover Fat. Mm-hmm. You know, and Horselover Fat is a linguistic pun on German and Latin, no, Greek. So he's actually giving signals here. You know, I'm two personalities. I'm Horselover Fat and I'm Philip K. Dick. And we are coexisting within that brain. I mean, this is why I get very frustrated that Life of Philip K. Dick is my least successful book, because people didn't get it. They didn't get where I was going with this. So Phil has this idea of the two brains. And then he came across the writings of somebody called Julian James. Mm-hmm. And in the early 1970s, Julian James was an academic at Princeton, and he wrote a book called The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And this is fascinating. You might find this fascinating. He argued that if you look back in history and you look back to the epics of Homer and everything, all the characters, there's no inner narrative. They don't have inner narrative. They talk to the gods, and the gods talk to them, and the gods guide them. And what James argued was that at that time, the two hemispheres of the brain were separate. It was bicameral. No, it was cameral. It was one brain. And the corpus callosum kept the two parts together. What he then argued was that as we developed language, the two brains split into two sections. Whereas initially, ancient people would hear the narrative of their own brain and think it was the voice of God. And again, Phil was fascinated by this. And this is why he argues about communicating with other entities that talk to you. Like he used to hear a voice, didn't he? Ever since his childhood, he heard a voice in his head that guided him. And this is, of course, what Valis
the AI
was.
Voice.
Is the AI voice, like the AI voice, which he called the Shekinah or Sophia. And the idea that the AI voice was guiding him. And do you remember the AI voice? There was one section, wasn't where the AI voice tells him that she's talking to him from an alternate future that is the American state, the Portuguese states of America. I can't remember her name now. She had this interesting name anyway. And he then believed that, there were alternate timelines all running off, which of course is what he did in The Man in the High Castle.
Yeah, that's
again, this is what he's conveying in The Man in the High Castle. And in The Man in the High Castle, what he's actually writing about, although he doesn't mention it, is something called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which was put forward in 1957 by a guy called Hugh Everett III, who wrote his PhD thesis as an explanation for something called Schrodinger's cat.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know, I mentioned earlier on that the idea that consciousness collapses the wave function. Everett didn't like that. It's called the Copenhagen interpretation. Niels Bohr and Max Born and everybody came up with that in the 1930s. He didn't like that. He was with Einstein, that, there's no relationship between consciousness and subatomic particles. And he came up with an alternate idea. And without, anybody can look up Schrodinger's cat if you want, and I could explain it later if we have time, but it gets quite complex. But the nub of the matter is that in order to get round it, he explained that the universe splits into thousands of copies of itself every nanosecond. In which case, within the macroverse, there is a version of a universe that every outcome of every decision comes to pass. Which means that you and I now you could decide, oh, Tony Peake's talking a load of rubbish, and walk off. Or you could sit here and continue listening. Or you could pick up a cup of coffee, or you could throw something at the screen. All those that can happen. Okay? Now, this again, there is more and more evidence for this model. There's a guy called David Deutsch that's been doing
Is this
research.
tantamount to the game of infinity that Dick talks about in his exegesis? That's what it sounds like.
Yes, it is. It's the idea that, again, Stephen Hawking, in his last academic paper, which he wrote with a guy called Thomas Hertog or Frank Hartle, I think it's Hertog, who's a researcher at CERN, called the top-down hypothesis of quantum mechanics. And he argued, this is Hawking, this is not some guy down the pub.
Yeah.
And he argued that at when the Big Bang took place, everything was just in a point, an infinitely tiny point, and all matter came out of that point and expanded outwards. But he argued that when that happened, every outcome of everything that could ever happen was already encoded in the universe mathematically. So our universe has followed a certain thread, but another universe will follow another thread and another one. And in my writings, I argue this happens to us as well. There are versions of you and I that will fulfill every outcome of every decision we can possibly make in our life.
Does that make everything then entirely deterministic?
Well, no, it doesn't. It does the opposite, because if you only lived one life and it was deterministic, that would be the case. But because you are making decisions every moment of your life, and every decision you make has an outcome, it means that there is no determinism. There's only determinism if you follow one path. But because there are all these alternatives, as you do, like when you play a third-person computer game, all the outcomes of all the decisions you can make as the game player are already programmed onto the disk. Your on-screen avatar, the sprite that you create in the game, only lives its life linearly because you guide it through down the corridors and where the monsters come out and eat it or whatever. That on-screen sprite, which I call the Eidolon, again coming back to my model, and Phil would get this, Phil would love this. So the Eidolon goes down, it gets eaten and it dies. But the game starts again, and a new Eidolon is created with no memory of the previous life. But the daemon, who's the game player, remembers the last game. So what happens is, over a period of many lives, like Groundhog Day, the movie, after many days, Phil Connors is allowed to move on. It's the same with our lives. We live the same. We live the same life as ourselves in different scenarios, just like Phil Connors in Groundhog Day lives the same day, but every day is different.
Yeah.
And I argue, and I call this, the world we live in there, the Bohmian IMAX. And we exist within this Bohmian IMAX that has all the outcomes of everything. Now, our daemon remembers what happened last time. So it guides us. If your doors of perception are sufficiently open, it can guide you. Phil's daemon was guiding him. Phil's daemon from the start was active in his life. And I believe Phil's daemon was active in his life neurologically because he had temporal lobe lability, which means that his temporal lobes were very, very susceptible to change within the environment. A guy called Michael Persinger was doing this work in Sudbury in the 1980s, where he had something called a God helmet. I think Phil talks about it in the exegesis. And he had people put a God helmet on, which was basically an American football hat, but they put over the temporal lobes electromagnetic fields, which meant that the temporal lobes started to react differently. So what effectively was happening, they were creating temporal lobe seizures in people. Now, when people had these seizures, as it were, the one thing they had was called a sensed presence. They felt there was somebody else next to them. And this is because they're becoming aware of their daemon. They're becoming aware that somebody else is in their head, that there is this other entity that shares their consciousness and guides them. And clearly, this was what was happening with Phil. Now, also, I believe, although Tessa disagrees with me on this, because Tessa and I discussed this, that Phil also was a classic migrainer. Because he had a lot of
we should mention all of these things that you're talking about, you punctuate at the end of The Man Who Remembered the Future. I mean, you go into some detail about each potential, I don't think you missed anything, outcome, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. So with Phil, for instance, these hallucinations he had, these sensations he had, were very similar to migraine. Because I have classic migraine, so I know the symptoms. Like, for instance, he used to have what's called Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where he'd feel that things were shrinking or getting bigger. And he describes this in a number of his letters and everything. So this is Alice in Wonderland syndrome. It's a known syndrome, and it's linked to migraine, classic migraine. Yeah. He also had phosphines in his eyes, and he'd see images, like the famous pink beam.
Yep.
The pink beam was effectively a phosphine effect, which was because what happened was the light that reflected off the pendant, which, as Tessa told me, was to do with something that was behind Phil. So in other words, when she was standing in the doorway, the girl,
yep,
with the drugs,
the delivery.
Phil was standing in front of her. A funny story, by the way. Tessa told me that when Phil was at the door, because I have a whole different narrative to what happened there, but when Phil was standing at the door, he'd been dozing in the living room, mm-hmm. and he got to the door before Tessa did, and this girl had a very low cleavage and the ichthus sign, and Phil was ogling her breast as far as Tessa was concerned. So Tessa comes over to him, sees what he's doing, and he suddenly pretends, oh, I wasn't looking at her breast. Woo, I've seen this incredible light. And he was trying to get off the hook of ogling the girl.
Yeah.
But what Tessa said was they had bought those kind of stickers you can put on a door or a glass door, mm-hmm. that kind of are transparent. They're a bit like the church windows that you have with different colours. They had one of those, and she said what had happened was the sun had come through the front door and then had reflected off the back window and reflected back again into his eyes. And this is what he saw. Now, I'd argue that when that happens, because I have the same kind of thing, certain photoaffective things can put me into an altered state of consciousness. And I work with people who are doing this, working with machines that flicker, and they can put you into altered states of consciousness. Again, we can talk about that later if you want. So 2 guys that are researching this in Austria. So the flicker then puts you into a slight altered state of consciousness. And this is where Phil used to go. And this is why light affected him in such a way. Because remember, he had the Kandinsky Klee effect, where he saw hundreds of paintings flashing past his eyes for hours on end. He was seeing Klees and he was seeing Kandinskys. Now, I believe
one of the impetuses, that's a word, for the scramble suit, right? In the scanner.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. Now, this is where things get really extraordinary, because I only made this link comparatively recently, because he also claimed he saw book covers flashing by. Okay. Now, I looked at the book covers and I thought, this is interesting, because he saw Klees and Kandinskys. And this book here, the cover of the book, if you look at this, it looks like a Kandinsky, doesn't it?
Yep.
So clearly, when I discuss in the book about Phil precognizing me, could it have been one of the books he saw and one of the images he saw flashing by was a precognition of this book cover?
Hmm. Now, is that connected to Anarch Peak?
It is.
I want to be selfish here quickly. On a couple of counts, because I'm writing two books right now on Phil, the one on the biographies and also all major life writings, really. And I have a question for you specifically about that, but I'm also writing a book solely on Richard Linklater's A Scanner Darkly for
Oh wow,
universe.
really? With his rotoscope?
Yeah. That's all. Yeah,
Yeah, because of course, he talked about Philip K. Dick, didn't he, in his Waking Life, the movie?
sure. Actually, he
Yeah.
played a character that delivered a monologue about that long essay that Dick wrote. A lot of it has to do with Flow My Tears. But
Mm.
this is a quick question, actually. You mentioned earlier when we were talking about split personalities that I assume that Dick was research. You mentioned an essay or a theorist specifically by name that Dick might have been researching
Orenstein.
with what was it? Or
Orenstein.
Orenstein. So that is Dick was reading him with an eye to the split personality that he was going to
Yeah.
present in a scan.
Yeah, he was reading the guys you need to look up in terms of this. Originally, is a guy called Roger Sperry, and Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize for surgery, I guess, for his split brain operations. Then there's a guy called Michael Gazzaniga who worked with him
That's the
on,
name. Yeah, okay.
yeah, Michael Gazzaniga, who's still alive and is still writing. But in terms of split brain operations, there's a lot of material out there. There's a lot of really interesting work being done. I mean, there's a guy, for instance, in New York who is using drugs to deaden the dominant hemisphere of the brain, and he's getting some fantastic results. There's a lot of work that could be done here, and I'm very interested because there's the WADA test, which is if you put sodium amytal into the carotid artery, it goes up and it deadens the dominant hemisphere. And when this happens, what happens is effectively demonic consciousness, which is the term I use, comes up. And one of my friends, she had this done on her because she has temporal lobe epilepsy. And she explained to me, she read my first book and she said, "You were the only person that I've ever read that describes exactly what my sensations are." And she said when she took it, she felt something else draw up from her deep subconscious. And it was her, but it was bigger and more powerful and more knowledgeable. And then she said she felt as the drug wore off that this other version then disappeared again. Now, again, if they do areas of deep hypnotism, and when they take people down to different levels of trance, they regularly discover, I think it was Erickson, I think was the hypnotist that did it. They take them down to various levels of hypnotism. And there's a certain point where another person comes in. They call it the hidden observer. And the hidden observer then takes control. And it's the daemon. And I then argue that when we have deja vu sensations, we are effectively logging into the consciousness of our higher self, the daemon, because of course the daemon knows what's going to happen next.
That model, the Damon Edelin model, it's not synonymous with
Yeah,
Idiot Cosmos and Koinos Cosmos. Dick's
no,
idea
it
is
is, it is, and it isn't.
connected but not synonymous, right? Like
Yeah, they are similar to in the sense of the inner world and the outer world.
right.
But I think the Idios Cosmos and the Koinos Cosmos are more ideas of how we perceive the world around us. Whereas I'd argue that where Dick was going with the idea of the two personalities, I think he was really onto something there. I'm glad he didn't get onto that, because then I couldn't have been a writer, because he'd have already done it. So,
But isn't
but
it contingent upon subject, everything you've actually been talking about? Isn't it contingent upon perception and subjectivity? Like
well,
how
this is where
time, for instance, how do you quantify it in the absence of that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no,
they're huge questions, but.
Well, I think one of the main issues we have to realize is there's a concept with God, I feel I look like a Rembrandt painting at the moment.
It's good. It's a good effect.
The chiaroscura is wonderful. But going back, so where was I going with this? Can you ask the question again? I just lost it.
For instance, the notion of time and quantifying time.
Oh, that's right.
Something
that's
like
right.
that, contingent upon, subject.
Yeah, right. So we have to realize we get very much fooled by our perceptions, in that we genuinely believe that I am something perceiving an external world, and the external world out there is real and it's tangible, which it obviously is tangible. Well, actually, technically it isn't, because we never actually touch anything, because it's something called electrostatic repulsion, which means that the end of every atom in your chair, for instance, the electrons at the end of each atom actually are negatively charged, as are the electrons in your bottom. So therefore, you never actually touch anything because they repulse each other, a negative and a negative, from schoolboy physics or school day physics. So we never actually touch anything anyway. So that's the first point. So the world is not literally tangible. We don't touch anything. Okay. But more importantly, it's the idea of whether that external world is as we perceive it. And modern day scientists who research this, called consciousness studies, have a term. They call it naive realism. And naive realism is the belief that whatever your senses are presenting to you is a one-to-one relationship with what's actually out there, because it isn't. We know this for one simple fact. At the back of each eye, there is something called a blind spot, where in the middle of the retina, there's where the optic nerve leaves the back of the eye and sends, where the messages are then sent by the optic nerve back to the visual cortex at the back of the mind, back of the brain. Because it's where the nerve leaves, it's not light sensitive, which means that we always have a blank area in our visual field. Okay. Now, because there's that blank area, we can normally override it when both our eyes are open, because we have binocular vision and they oversee each other to give us a stereo effect. But if you close your eye, you should technically be able to see or not see your blind spot. There should be an area where you can't see. The brain fills that in. The brain creates, from the information around it, what should be there. Now, if the brain can do that for a small part of your visual field, why can't it do it for the whole of your visual field? And of course, it does do that. It does it in dreams. It does it in, you take hallucinogenic substances like LSD. It creates a whole visual world based upon your subconscious. Now, on top of that, your visual world that you think is real is created by photons, which are little points of, they're either little points of energy, electromagnetic energy, or they're a wave, depending on whether you look at them or not. But that's getting more and more technical. But let's say they're little point particles, little photons. Mm-hmm. Now, photons themselves are weird because they have no extension in space, and they can only travel at the speed of light. And at the speed of light, time stops. So from the point of view of a photon, there is no time. So even the things that you see, make you see things, are weird. But let's just say the photon comes into your eye, goes through your aqueous humor, and hits the back of your eye on the retina. And when all the photons hit the retina, they create kind of signals that can, like an image. That is then changed into an electric signal, electrochemical signal, which then goes down the optic chiasma. Now, the image on the retina is postage stamp sized and inverted and bent. That signal encoding that particular picture is then sent to the visual cortex, the darkest part of the brain. And the brain then takes that signal and magically, and it is magically, takes that signal and information, reinterprets it to create this three-dimensional surround image that we see from a inverted postage stamped image. We are not seeing what is out there. The brain is creating an anticipation of what it thinks might be out there. This is why people can be fooled. This is why optical illusions work.
You're almost describing AI as it currently exists. you know?
AI, as in I, yeah. um, yeah, yeah. No, to an extent, because this is the problem here. You know, we have again the substrate problem with AI. The idea now, for instance, people have said people could be made immortal if we had sufficient processing power that we could scan somebody's brain down to the subatomic level and have all that information, then upload that into a machine. Would that be that person? Because they've got all the information that describes you, describes your brain processes and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be you? And the argument is no, it wouldn't, because consciousness seems to just appear when there is a certain degree of complexity within any system. Consciousness just magically appears. How it magically appears is nobody has any idea, but that's what it's supposed to do. So the argument is with AI, is this was what's going to happen with AI. Will AI develop to such an extent that suddenly, when it reaches a certain critical point, consciousness will come out, technically known as an epiphenomenon of the state, and suddenly AI will become conscious.
Well, the singularity, right?
Oh, it's the singular. Yeah, it's the Ray Kurzweil stuff, isn't it? And the idea of the singularity, that we become melded with machines, and our consciousness and everything else, we will become almost cyborgs. But because we don't know where consciousness comes from, you know, I think it was 1994, a young Australian philosopher called David Chalmers stood up at the University of Arizona and made a speech. And he turned around and he said, science has two problems. We have the soft problem of how the brain works, and then we have the hard problem of how the brain creates consciousness. And the hard problem still hasn't been answered. Nobody's at first base understanding. As I said in one of my books, is it the addition of one molecule, one electron, that suddenly consciousness just appears with all our self-referential awareness? You know I'm something. I know that I have a consciousness that exists, that is me. I'm not a machine. I'm not just something responding to external stimuli. And every single sentient human being knows that, except a group of particular individuals called eliminative materialists, with leadership under a guy called Daniel Dennett, who died a few weeks, about 6 or 7 months ago, who wrote a very hubristic book called Consciousness Explained. He didn't explain consciousness. He came up with something called the internal drafts theory. You know, it's just, you know, nobody knows what consciousness is, and anybody that pretends to do so. But it is something, and it's the only thing.
Is that what you're trying to get to? Like, you know, there's so many ways in which, as you said, you mirror Philip K. Dick. I get it. I mean, I really get it now. And of course, what he was really interested in, especially in the last, when he was writing the exegesis, is the truth, getting at whatever that might be. Is that ultimately your project too? Is with respect?
Well, yeah, it's one of the things that, as since a child, it's just fascinated me that, you know, what is going on? What, you know, as Phil said, you know, that there is something just not quite right about reality. You know, and he does that in his novels. You know, the idea that, you know, you pick something up and there's a little thing underneath saying, place this here. You know, the idea that reality just doesn't seem right. It's, again, I love the quote from The Matrix, you know, where Morpheus says, have you spent all your life just thinking that there's something not quite right?
Yeah.
Is there a little thing in your brain that is just nagging at you all the time? And of course, as you say, this is what Linklater does in those wonderful monologues he has in
Waking Life.
Waking Life.
Yeah.
You know, where that guy wanders around asking people fantastic questions. And for instance, in Waking Life, in the Linklater film, there's a wonderful section where you have the two characters from After Midnight, you know.
Ethan Hawke.
Juliet Delpy and the
Ethan
American
Hawke.
actor. Yeah, Ethan Hawke. And they're lying in bed.
Yeah.
And they're discussing things. And he turns around and said, you know, I've had a thought. Just imagine if we're all existing in the final seconds of our life. And this is cheating the fairy. This is my model.
Yeah.
And when that came out, somebody contacted me and said, my God, somebody's talking about your theory. And it's Linklater. And again, Linklater is somebody I'd love to have a conversation with, just like I'd have loved to have a conversation with Philip K. Dick. Like William Sarrell is somebody that I know you've interviewed on the show.
Yeah.
I mean, Bill and I have been in communication for many, many years.
And you mentioned him in the book too. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, Brad Steiger, because again, Phil believed he was a star child. He believed that he'd come from somewhere else, that he had been imploded on this planet, and he believed he'd been abducted. As I did, and him and Tessa both believed they were in some special program for gifted children. So there is definitely, Phil felt that he wasn't quite right within this world in some way. And some of us are like this. We question everything, and we want answers, and we want to understand. But within our finite life, we'll never get there, because we will never know the true answers to these things. And that's why I think it's such a tragedy that Phil died so young. And I just always think that what a conversation I could have with him, because I get him so precisely. I know I was reading exegesis, and I was going, tick, God, he's gone there now. He's going the same places I went. He'd have come out with my writing before I'd have done so, had he not tragically died. But of course, the final thing about Phil, and we'll go into the Anarch-Dick, but my favorite story about Phil is his predicting his own death. I mean, this is just extraordinary. And again, I think I'm the only writer that's expanded on this. I know that it was mentioned by the guy that wrote the Anubis Gate, his friend
Tim Powers.
Tim Powers mentions it in the introduction to one of the sections on the collected letters. But I'd spotted this before I'd come across that. And the reason I'd spotted it was really weird, is a few years ago, I was online and I got a message or a link to somebody who was trying to sell some of Philip K. Dick's original letters. And one of the letters they had photocopied and put on the website. And this was a letter that was sent in 1973, I think, something like that. I can't remember the exact date. I can find it if we need it. But suffice to say,
before, or actually, because 2374 was the not the extent.
Yeah. So it was during that time, and I think Phil had opened up a series of writing letters, pen pal, with a lady called Gloria Krentz Bush, who lived in Montana, I think. And they used to exchange letters. And there's one of the letters which is extraordinary because it's typed initially, and then it has a handwritten bit at the bottom. And the typing, and I'm paraphrasing here, but Phil says something like, last night, I asked the entity to show itself, because it was the entity that had been manifesting during the whole of the 2374 thing. I asked the entity to manifest itself.
Was it Thomas yet?
I don't think it was Thomas quite yet. I think Thomas came slightly later, didn't it?
Okay.
Because at that stage, he hadn't made the link with the 33 AD idea of, living in this simulation. But he says in that, he asked the entity to show itself. And then he said he went into a hypnagogic state, which I was discussing before, this liminal state, which Phil seemed to slip into quite a lot. And then he said, and then I saw undersea cities and something else, and then one clear, stark image. Lying between a sofa and a coffee table lay a dying man, or a dead man, lying on his stomach. And then he underlines it, and he handwrites in the corner, Gloria, I think I'm becoming precognitive. Okay? Now, when Phil died, he'd split up from Tessa. He was in a new relationship. He'd split up with Tessa. He was living on his own. And every Thursday, I think it was every Thursday night or every Wednesday night, I can't remember exactly, but we'd meet up with Tim Powers and all their friends and Tim's wife, and they had a little book club and they'd discuss things. That afternoon, Phil was seen going out to buy a newspaper. And he came back and he wasn't answering his phone, and his then girlfriend was getting quite disturbed. So she contacts Powers on the phone and says, I'm worried about Phil. And they say, well, it's strange because he hasn't turned up. Meanwhile, the neighbours had noticed that his front door was open. And they went in, it was in Fullerton, I think, was it? And they went into the house and they phoned Tim Powers because they found Phil on the floor lying after the stroke on his stomach between a coffee table and the sofa.
Right. Yeah.
In exactly the scenario that Phil had described. Now, Tim confirmed this to me because I contacted Tim on this and he confirmed it. Now, I did a documentary for French and German television a few years ago, ART television, and people like Rutger Hauer were interviewed it, and I was interviewed for it as well. And they did a mock-up of the scene to show the circumstances that I'd pointed out. Now, I believe that Phil saw his own death, and he was, this is the interesting point, he was not dead at that time. He'd had the stroke, but Tessa told me that he was still communicative. So when they got him to the hospital, Tessa said she went to visit him, and he was very agitated, but he could speak. And then he had the second stroke, didn't he? And then he died about 10 days later when they switched off the machine. So he was still, part of him was still consciously aware. And I argue that his daemon was still aware. And his daemon was aware that he was lying, dying, and back placed that memory into his earlier self.
Yeah.
Because we know, for instance, that Phil claimed that when he was a child, he used to see a figure at the end of his bed. And the figure was an older man looking at him. And when Phil got into his 40s, he started having dreams of his bedroom as a child, standing at the end of the bed, looking at himself. And as he said, that was me. The person at the end of the bed was the future me, looking at the young me in bed. So clearly, Phil's consciousness was able to flip through time, through orthogonal time. Because he did this time and time again. He said, that he visualized scenes and places from his past. Yeah. So clearly Phil was in a position that his consciousness was all over the place within orthogonal time. And that's why he was precognitive. That's why he was the man who saw the future. Extraordinary. But going back again to the point you wanted me to make, remember I made this point about Phil seeing this book and the Kandinsky type imagery. I was invited to give a talk at Bolton Library, and you'll know Bolton from living in Liverpool. It's an area sort of just north of Liverpool. Well, it's actually north of Manchester, but let's not split hairs on that one. And I was invited to speak at Bolton Library. Now, Bolton Library is really interesting in that it's in a place called Le Mans Drive, and it has these beautiful Victorian buildings. And at the back of the library is a lecture theatre. So it's kind of like a theatre, and the audience are all around you. And I was giving a talk on one of my earlier books. I think it was The Daemon. And in the book, in the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, I'm talking about various things like I've done here about people recognizing the future. And I had a slide on Philip K. Dick. So I had a photograph of Philip K. Dick and two of his books either side. And as I did so, up in the extreme right of the audience, there's a commotion. There's about 5 or 6 people. There was about 100 people there or something. 5 or 6 people start chattering away to each other. And I'm thinking, you're ill-mannered. What's your problem? And they go, anyway, so I finished the talk, and one of them, the group comes down to me, and the group leader comes over to me, and he said, well, sorry about that, but we're absolutely stunned. And I said, why? And he said, well, the reason we're here is I came into the library earlier on today to pick up a book that I'd put on order. And he showed me the book, and it was the Philip K. Dick book that was on my show, the same edition. And he said, now, I came in here to get this book. I saw that you were speaking, and I thought to myself, this sounds an interesting talk. So I phoned up my friends, and we came. So we come and we're standing here. And I'd said to the group, I picked up this Philip K. Dick book today, and we were looking through it before we came in. Sit down. And I'm doing my talk. And then suddenly I put this thing up on, and I say, and this book by Philip K. Dick. And he said, I have the book in my hand. And we go, my God. And then he said, but that's not the weirdest thing. And I said, what is? And he said, do you know that Philip K. Dick predicted you? And I said, what? And he said, have you read the book Counterclock World? And I said, no, I haven't got around to reading that yet. And he said, do you know in Counterclock World, there's a character who's in sleep state between life and death. And he'd created a theory about life after death, that there's this liminal state, like the Bardo state. And he said, and guess what Philip K. Dick called him. And this guy said to me, he said, considering that Phil could give a name of anybody, there's billions of names that you could come up with. And I said, yeah, okay, what did he call him? He said, Anarch Peake. And I went, you're joking. And he said, no. And he said, so imagine that Phil recognized you in some way on a book cover, and he couldn't quite read it right, and could only see the A and the N, and then could see your surname slightly spelt wrongly without the E on the end.
Yeah.
He said he would have Anne Peake, and then he'd put Ark onto it because it's a religious figure, and he'd come up with Anarch Peake. Now, I then thought, and I posited this, and I thought, when I started writing the book on Philip K. Dick, and I came across this incident where he saw all the book covers, because he saw the book covers and the paintings, that if he had loads of book covers flashing by really quickly, and this one flashes by really quickly, and he just glances and sees a Peake, what was that? Now, I don't believe that for 1 minute, but I do believe it's a lovely story.
Oh,
and
it's great.
Really weaves in this extraordinary story of wheels within wheels, jigsaw puzzles, holographs, things within things.
Who was the cover designer for the book? Have you talked to them?
I don't know, actually. I really don't know. Again, the publisher just goes off and tells me what the book cover is going to be like, and they say that I have a choice, but they don't. If I turn around and said I hated it, so I don't know. But I guess I would suspect that they just bought the rights to that cover. I mean, I don't know if it says anywhere.
I bet it does. I haven't looked, but it would be interesting to get their impression.
Yeah. Why did they come across that?
Yeah.
Because when I saw the cover as well, I thought, Philip K. Dick has got a character called Arctor, hasn't he?
Yeah. Well,
Bob
that's the Scanner Darkly protagonist, Bob.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then there is a term, isn't there, called the cracked actor.
Oh.
And I thought, that's a cracked Arctor.
Yep. For sure.
Love
it. I love that idea. Incidentally, so in this book, this is another thing I wanted to ask you. I have included your book, and I am on that section of the chapter that I'm writing right now. I've grouped it together with psychobiographies. The other fellows I'm writing about are Rickman in that chapter, and of course, To the High Castle, his main, which you quite liked. I think you mentioned that, and I love it.
Oh, I did. Yeah, wonderful.
In addition
wasn't
to
sure about
other
the TV series, but
pardon.
I wasn't sure about the TV series, but I certainly enjoyed the Man in the High Castle.
He's meticulous, like you. He's meticulous, Anyway, that book, in addition to his interview biotexts, as I call them, and the more recent Philip K. Dick on film, and then I've just segued into your book, and after your book, I'm going to do Kyle Arnold's The Divine Madness of Philip K. Dick, and he's actually a psychotherapist, if I'm not mistaken. And then Eric Davis's High Weirdness.
I was going to say Eric Davis, yeah, great guy.
How does that sit with you? Do you think of this in terms of a psychobiography?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. I think the whole Phil can be analysed in so many ways in terms of this. This is one of the things that I felt that some of the earlier biographies had not gone into Philip K. Dick the man. What made him what he was. It's a narrative of his books and his stories and his influences, but there's so much more to him. He's such a rich, fascinating person to dive into, and understand what made him tick. Because as you know, the last chapter in the book, because I'm a qualified psychometrician,
right?
And I managed to get hold of the raw scores.
Yes.
What happened was,
incidentally, I took that test myself online yesterday.
Did you?
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see how
there's some alignments there, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because in 1958, Raymond Cattell, who was the guy that created the 16PF, it sent a questionnaire out to 58 different writers, asking them to fill in the questionnaire, or many more, I think, but 58 replied, including Phil. And I was able to get hold of the raw scores from Phil's responses. And
Well,
because
didn't you get that from Rickman was the first one to, doesn't he mention them at the end of To the High Castle, I think?
oh, I don't know, maybe.
Well, I think you mentioned that that you pulled the data from Rickman, but then you do so much more with it, you know? I mean,
Well, the thing is,
you interpret it.
because I was doing it professionally,
Hmm.
in that I was responsible for, as a human resources guy for an airline, and we used to do profiling of the pilots,
Oh,
basically because the dangers, you've got to make sure that the pilots work together very well, because clearly that there had been plane crashes in the past where the pilots had conflicted because they were different types of personalities. So you had to match them, or I believed you had to match them. So I used to do the profiling, which meant that I had to do a formal course on it, and also be examined on my interpretations. So my interpretation is professional in terms of this. So I'm able to take the raw scores, then weight them and everything else. And Phil's profile was really very intriguing, very intriguing.
yeah.
It was probably the strangest profile I'd ever seen.
Yeah, and
By the way,
it was
I,
conflicted, right?
oh, extremely so.
Yeah.
Now, I believe this is because Phil was trying to manipulate the answers. He wanted to
Ah,
come up
right.
in a
You mentioned.
particular way. And unfortunately for Phil, there is a fake right sim questions that can wheedle out whether somebody is trying to exaggerate the profiles. Because people say you can cheat with psychometric profiles. Well, you can't actually, because psychometric designers are cleverer than that. They know if you're trying to cheat because there are certain questions you have to consistently answer
And
in a particular
right,
way.
I noticed that that's one of the reasons I took it just to get a sense. There are questions that aren't the exact same, but almost the same
Yeah,
throughout.
I've never told a lie. Things like that.
Yeah,
If
yeah, yeah.
somebody's delusional, they will answer, "No, I never have." And of course, everybody has told a lie at some stage or other.
Right.
So, but his some of them were very extreme because it works on stens, which are standard tens statistically. You expect people to be in the middle, between 1 and 10. The results are going to be 5, 6, or 7. But Phil was a 10 over here, and he was a 10 over here, and a
Yeah.
9 here. And some of them, the anxiety levels were incredibly high. And he was so complex. I remember once, actually, as a very funny aside, I did a profile on a pilot, and I was really dreading it because it came out quite strongly that he really didn't like criticism. So I sit down with him and I'm going through it. And I said, "It does seem here that you don't like criticism." He stood up and he banged the table and he said, "How dare you say I don't like being criticized?" And I expected him to laugh, but he didn't,
Huh.
which proved to me that people, the behaviors they have, they think are right. To them, this is the correct way of doing things.
Yeah.
So, but Phil's, and in the end of the book, I mean, I haven't got time to go into detail now, but I think that is one of the most unique elements of the book, is me going through that. It's worth going through the whole book just for that, because it's very, very intriguing. But again, an interesting character who was profoundly unusual.
Did you
Profoundly.
did you find in because the book's in 3 parts. First part is more or less a straight biography. And you had to do that in order to write the second 2 parts. Couldn't just do the
No,
clinical part, right? And that's
no.
why you did it, I assume. Because
Yeah, that's why,
a lot of that is covered by Sutton and Rickman and Williams and so forth. Yeah.
totally, as I say in the book, that the biographical detail was literally me taking the material,
Yeah.
because and interviewing. I interviewed Tessa, and I contacted Anne and 2 or 3 other people, but effectively Ray as well. But generally, the
Did you
information was
talk to
taken on.
You mentioned Carrera's book? Did you talk to him at all?
No, I'd have loved to.
Yeah.
I found his book fascinating.
He's
As
tough
you
to pin
say,
down.
it's a very different book, and it's
Yeah.
vaguely odd in the sense that he takes Phil's position of what Phil was thinking and things. But that's so powerful. It works as a kind of a fraction. It's a kind of a fictional but truth, which I think he did very, very well.
Yeah.
But I acknowledge the fact that the biographical details. But as you rightly say, I needed the biographical details to be able to then put the picture together that I wanted to put. But I was also interested in looking at the genesis of his ideas, the genesis of why he had certain themes, which I dug into, I think, a little bit deeper than other people,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of why he was writing them. His interest in Gnosticism, how Gnosticism imbues a lot of his novels and his worldview.
Mm-hmm.
How his interest, as I say, in psychology, his interest in split brain operations, his interest in time, his interest in the nature of reality, all come through. I mean, he was never a scientist, but he was a great ideas man, and he would take ideas. Like, one of the things that fascinated me was how he came up with the Lincoln simulacra, and he wrote that before Disney World had done it, by about a year. Now, you could argue that, it was 1964, it was 100 years after the Gettysburg Address, and therefore it was highly likely that Lincoln would be of interest to people.
Yeah.
But, I would argue, no, he had precognized that and put it into his storyline,
And that's one of the
and of
things
course,
you include at the end. That's one of the many precognitive examples that you provide. Yeah.
I mean, whether they are genuine precognitive. The other thing I really loved, quite obscure, but the bit where he has that short story, Piper in the Wood.
Mm-hmm.
That one from back in 1953. And what he'd done is he'd read the Kenneth Grahame book, the English writer who'd written a book called The Wind in the Willows. And in The Wind in the Willows, which is a children's book, but there is a very strange sequence in the middle of Wind in the Willows where the central characters go into a kind of time slip, and they encounter the great god Pan. And it's really, really weird and very, very, very disturbing. And it's all about how we've lost memory. And the wind in the willows actually is the wind, the willows, the sound that we have lost. Because Phil was fascinated by amnesis, wasn't he? The idea that we have forgotten who we are. Like in The Divine Invasion, Manny, the little boy, is God who's forgotten he's God.
Right.
And Phil was fascinated by something called anamnesis, which is the Platonic term for loss of forgetting. Yeah. And in my books, I discuss, in ancient Greek, the Eleusinian mysteries, what people would do. They believed that when you died, you would be carried over to the land of the dead, where you'd be given the choice of drinking the waters of the river Lethe, which was the river of forgetting. And if you did that, you were allowed to go back and live your life again because you'd forgotten what you were before. Whereas if you decided to stay, you wouldn't lose your memory. And Phil very much played on that, and he expanded on that whole concept in this story, and the idea that we have forgotten who we are. We have forgotten that we are divine sparks trapped inside this idios cosmos, to use his terms.
Yeah.
We are trapped within there, because central within Gnosticism belief is that every human being has a shard of the pleroma inside them, and it's trapped, because they argue that this world is the creation of a being called the demiurge, Yaldabaoth. And Yaldabaoth is the god of the Old Testament, the god that's smiting everybody and killing everybody. And he is the false creator, the demiurge. And this is how Gnostics, it's quite fascinating how they came up to this conclusion. The Gnostics were a schismatic Christian sect in the 1st century AD, and they had a problem with something called theophany. And theophany is the existence of evil. The argument is, if God is a good God, why does he tolerate the existence of evil? And they concluded that it's because he's not the real God. There is a God behind the God. In fact, a friend of mine who runs a podcast called Aeon Byte, that subtitle is called The God Behind God. And the idea is that there is Yaldabaoth, who is the demiurge, who's the false creator, who believes he's God. He's delusional. And he's created all of us out of evil matter, because matter is imbued with evil, and we are made of matter. And he's created what he calls the Kanoma, which is the illusionary world. It's what the Hindus would call Maya.
Okay.
The illusionary world is what Phil would say again. This is an illusion. You've got to see through the illusion, see through the simulacra, or the simulacra. So we are trapped within this, but we all have this inner knowing that there's something greater. Because it was the point you made before, what drives me? It's that nagging something. It's that nagging that, as again,
Back to the
in the
Matrix.
Matrix.
Yeah.
Back to the Matrix again, where he says to Neo, take the red pill or the blue pill, and it's so, and this is the thing, I think this is all something we all subliminally know. When people come across my writing, and I get normally 6 or 7 emails a day from somebody who's just picked up one of my books at random, and they will always turn around to me and say, you've blown my mind. These are things I've been thinking about for years, but not been able to put them in words. And I'd argue that all of the ideas I put forward and all the ideas Phil put forward, they are all part of the zeitgeist, part of the Weltgeist. They are part of the Jungian archetypes. We know these things are true, but we don't know how. It's just a nagging that we feel that there's something not quite right with the world. And but underlying, we all know this, we subliminally know it. And what I believe I've done with my cheating the ferryman hypothesis is that I've said, this is what could be happening. We are all living our lives again. We all have a guide called the daemon, and we will come back and live this life or variations on this life many, many, many times. And on occasions, we remember, and that's a deja vu sensation, and we remember the fact we've been here before and we've done this before.
Yeah.
And I believe I'm the only writer to come up with an explanation to explain deja vu. I know that there are neurological explanations like the Ephron thesis from 1961. It's now out of the water. It's called the visual pathways hypothesis. It's wrong. It doesn't work neurologically anymore. So we're back to square one. What is deja vu? Is it recognition of circumstances? No, because I know people who have precognitive deja vus. I've actually witnessed one where somebody was in an altered state of consciousness where they said something and then they said it again. There really is evidence that we have short-term precognition. We know it neurologically, we know it physiologically. There's something called the Phi experiment, which has proven that we can monitor our immediate future. A guy called Dean Radin did a series of experiments a few years ago where he proved that we can anticipate the future immediately, subliminally. We know what's going to happen. This is why you jump when you hear a bang. You hear a bang, you jump before the bang. I'll guarantee that most people out there will say, yeah, that's happened to me. Because what you do is you go, and then the bang happens. It's because this part of you was already scanned a second in the future.
Yeah.
Because going back again to the specious present.
Are issues of this nature, so this is a good segue to, you've given me so much of your time, and frankly, I feel 20 times smarter for having listened to you today. Segue to your most recent book, Near-Death Experiences. In that, do you tie, from what I've read about it, I get the sense that you tie together a lot of what you've been working on your entire career in that book. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, what I wanted to do was, I've been researching near-death experiences. My first book is The Life After Death, effectively was discussing near-death experiences. But I really wanted to write a book that was different to any other near-death experience book, because the vast majority of near-death experience books are interesting and fascinating, but they're just a series of stories. Doris went out of her body, met her grandparents, met Jesus, came back. Fred had a time slip and da-da-da-da. And it's all it happened to me. But nobody's written a book and said, well, let's look at the bigger picture. Let's look at what's happening neurologically. Let's look at what's happening neurophysiologically. Let's look what's happening anthropologically. Let's look back in history. Let's find out when were near-death experiences first recorded. Across the world, are near-death experiences different in Chinese culture, in Japanese culture, in Korean culture, in Indian culture, to Western culture? Do people, when they encounter entities, do they encounter different types of entities, different kinds of beings of light? And in this case, I've worked quite closely in terms of interpretation with a guy called Gregory Shushan, who's an anthropologist, whose new book is just coming out, which is very interesting, his new book on near-death experiences in ancient civilizations. I've got friends who are anthropologists who are telling me about these things. I then wanted to understand what the latest research is telling us. Are there links between near-death experiences and dimethyltryptamine, DMT, the substance I was talking about earlier? And there are. For instance, the guy that wrote the foreword, Dr. Pascal Michael, the neuroscientist. He's been doing research into the overlap between the two, and there's definitely overlap. Now, in order to do this, I read virtually probably 98% of every single academic paper that's been written on near-death experiences over the last 60 years. I read them all, took the material from them, read the histories, read the anthropological books that have been written. I mean, I found some fantastic material of near-death experiences in Japan, and how it ties in with the Shinto tradition and everything else as well, plus the Bardo state within Tibetan Buddhism. Wow. So there are lots of interesting things, but within all of this, there is something consistent. So the phenomenon, there is no question, the near-death experience is real. Absolutely no question. The question is how we interpret it. Are people really dying? Because, of course, in the book, I go into great detail of what do we mean by death. When we talk about brain death, what do we really mean? How do we define what is dead and what is alive? Yeah. How do we define what is conscious and what is not? So I then take many famous cases and look at them in detail. And I guarantee that I found, and it's very true, you start digging back in a lot of these cases, they fall apart. They're nowhere near as convincing as you first believe them to be. Because what people do is, somebody writes something about it, and some other writer comes on and copies it, and somebody else copies it, and somebody else copies it. But nobody ever goes back to the medical reports. What happened in the hospital at that time? What did the doctors say? You know, for instance, there's one very famous case called Maria's Shoe, which took place in the Harborview Hospital in Seattle, where some lady had a near-death experience, claimed she floated out of her body and saw a sports shoe stuck on the roof as she was floating above. And the people said, oh, she couldn't have possibly known this. So I went right back to some research that had done on it. Of course she bloody well could, because it could be seen from other rooms in the hospital and could be seen from people going into the entrance, the main reception area. But nobody went back that far. You know, so, you know, she could still have seen it, but that's not the point. I also make a lot of links between UFO encounters and near-death experiences. There's a lot of parallels between abductions and near-death experiences. In fact, I have a series of cases in the book, and again, this is completely new. Nobody else has noticed this. The whole series of cases from New Guinea in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s of individuals that had near-death experiences. But if you look into them, they're UFO encounters. There's one guy who actually goes into this floating house that's spinning round. It's hovering above the ground and it's spinning. It's a UFO. And he goes into the place and he meets greys in his near-death experience. Huh. So I argue that these phenomena are overlapped and the same.
I assume you channel some Jung there in terms of his book on flying saucers, right? But does he talk?
Oh yeah, the mystery scene in the sky.
It's been so long since I read that though. But does he connect it at all with abductions and gray encounters and so forth?
He connects it more with archetypes. And the symbols of eternity and things. Whereas some of the later writers like John Keel and Jacques Vallée, they very much link it with the fae, the fairies, the little people, the way it's throughout history, the way in which it's developed, how the phenomenon follows cultures, the way in which in the 1890s we had the airships with Germans on board. Then we go forward to the Science Age, and in the 1950s we had the Nordics, tall blonde people. Then we had the monsters. Then we had, after Whitley Strieber's book Communion, we had the Greys. Mm-hmm. And the UFOs themselves, they culture track. They follow us. They are, again, egregores. They are emanations of our own expectations of what there are. I do this event, as I say, every year in Southern California, in Indian Wells. Last year, a group of people went outside, and a UFO apparently flew over, and they all saw it, and it came back again. Now, this was a UFO flying over a UFO convention. Did they know the UFO convention was taking place? Why did they do that? And these people were convinced of what was happening.
Yeah.
You know, I saw some other lady who showed me a video of a UFO she filmed over Southend in the south of England. She's standing next to a woman. You see it in the film. The woman standing next to her can't see it, even though it appears on the film. I could not explain that. She said the other person could not see it, but it's not a projection of my mind because it's out there. Well, I argue you could have projected it into the camera. Your expectations could have projected into the camera itself. It shows the power of the mind. It's not just psychosomatic. There's more to this, because I think we create these things, we draw them in. And I think there's a lot more area here. And I think the whole fact that people feel that they meet dead people. People when they die, they turn around and say, I met my uncle, I met this, that, and the other. I've got evidence of children that meet Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse isn't dead, but Mickey Mouse never existed. I've got other people that used to see Elvis Presley. Children also see school friends or school teachers. So clearly, whatever this entity is that they meet, it's not what it's pretending to be. And you know why? Because it's the daemon.
Yeah.
It's the daemon manifesting itself as you die to make you feel better. And it will come in whatever form you feel. So if you're a Hindu, it'll look at one thing. If you are whatever, it'll do something different.
Yeah.
This is how it works. The daemon, again. So coming back to Phil, split brain operations and everything, it all links in.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. We've done about 2 hours, if that's sufficient.
Yeah, my wife is probably going to be banging the door down in a minute.
I seriously appreciate it. So we've been discussing, among a million other things, Tony's book. Although, is that coming through in a mirror image?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
The Man Who Remembered the Future, which I'm writing about and love. Thank you so much. There's something that my co-host usually says at the end. Stay paranoid, dickheads. We'll see you next time.